talking to you today, as Gary said, about the German capture of Fort Douaumont on the 25th of February 1916. Now, for those of you who aren't so familiar with the Battle of Verdun, this happened on the 5th day of the battle. The battle lasted for 300 days, and you might wonder why anything that happened on the 5th day was important or interesting or affected the battle in any way. And the answer to all those is yes, it was important, and it did affect the battle in various ways, both on the battle from the French side and from the German side. And it has actually, the capture has some comedy aspects to it, which make it rather interesting. So just going back to situate Verdun, for those of you who aren't so familiar with it, this is the Western Front in 1916, and you can see Verdun there in the middle, surrounded by a salient. Now, the salient was formed in the second month of the war, September 1914, when the Germans tried to pinch out Verdun because it was too powerful to attack frontally, and they failed to do so. The reason they tried to pinch it out, and the reason why it was so powerful, was it was entirely surrounded by forts that were built after 1871, the end of the Franco-Prussian War. You will remember that after the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans annexed Alsace and a big part of Lorraine, and France lost its natural borders of the Vosges and the Rhine, and the new border was just a political line drawn on the map, and the French fortified their eastern border by building chains of forts based on certain towns that had detached forts built all around them. And this is Verdun, as you can see, in the center with an inner ring. That's the inner line of resistance, and that's the outer line of resistance. And there's Fort Douaumont there. And Verdun, in fact, was the most powerful part of the fortifications of eastern France because it was the closest to the German border of the time. All these forts look east over the German border, which was only 25 kilometers away. Of those, Verdun was regarded as Douaumont rather, regarded as the keystone of the arch, the thing that held the whole system together. Now, as I say, the Germans tried to pinch it out. They failed, and as a result of that, when they dug in after the Marne, they dug in far enough away from the guns in the forts and fieldworks, both around Verdun and south of the city, to make sure they were out of range, and that created this salient, which from down there at Saint-Mihiel all the way around is about 100 kilometers. Now, the only fighting in the salient in 1915 was where those red dots are, and the rest of it went quiet. And because it went quiet, and because it was so powerful, it was stripped. So by the end of 1915, pretty well every movable gun had gone. There were guns under the rotating turrets. The forts had no battery, had no garrisons in anymore. Any movable supplies had been run down. The garrison of the salient, which in 1914 had been 66,000 men, had been run down to the absolute minimum. And on this part here, just north of Verdun, there were 2 infantry divisions, and they were under strength. Now, this is the place chosen by this man, General Erich von Falkenhayn, to launch the operation that was going to bring the war to an end in 1916. Now, I'm not going into a lot of detail about why Falkenhayn chose Verdun, because that's another hour's talk all on its own, and people have been arguing about it for the last 100 years. And it's actually not very difficult to understand when you know Verdun and you know how weak the salient was. By the time he was looking for a place where he thought he could launch an operation that would bring the war to an end before things got worse for Germany, remember, Germany and Austria-Hungary, every time they lose a man, they have no replacement. Russia has untold millions. France and Britain have colonies. Germany and Austria-Hungary haven't. If Germany is going to win, it has to win really before the middle of 1916, before the new armies come in. So that's why he's got to do something in the winter of 1916. Verdun is the weakest point on the Western Front, and in particular it's got the weakest supply lines. The supply lines have been destroyed in the attempt to take Verdun in 1914, and that entire salient there that I showed you was only supplied by one light railway during 1915, which is fine in 1915, but if you're going to launch a huge artillery assault, how on earth are the French going to get themselves together to resist it with only one light supply line? So at the end of December, he put to the Kaiser there his plan to attack on one little bit of the salient there. That's the northern front, that's 8 miles. And there's Verdun down there, so it's immediately north of Verdun. And he's only going to attack on one side of the river, and that's called the right bank because it's on the right-hand side of the flow of the river. And the plan is to simply crush the French defences such as they are with an immense artillery barrage of the sort that has never been seen before in the world. So over 1,000 guns and another 250 mortars here, firing on this front here and all the way down, in fact, down to Verdun as well. When the resistance has been crushed, and it is going to be so totally crushed that this is going to be a parade march through, according to some of the gunners, then the 3 Army Corps will simply move forward and come down here to that line of hills there, and that's where they're going to stop. That's the strategic heights. And as you see, they will threaten Verdun. They will command the access into Verdun from all sides. You bring the guns up here, you control the River Meuse, the stopping places on the river, and the French with one light supply line can't possibly do anything to resist. The aim is to inflict such a huge number of casualties on the French in so short a time that basically the army says we're not fighting and the politicians lose their nerve. And it's going to be very fast. It's going to start on the 12th of February 1916, and the Kaiser is to attend a victory parade in Verdun on the 29th of February. That was his birthday, and armistice negotiations would have started. And I just told you it took 300 days, so you can see it went wrong. Well, it went wrong. It went wrong from the start, actually, because on the 12th of February, the weather was too bad and they couldn't move off. So they start off on the 21st, and it goes reasonably well. The bombardment is not Bruckmüller in 1918 by any means, but it's terrifying to men who've never experienced anything like that. And facing the 3 Army Corps are 2 infantry divisions that are under strength. One has been in Champagne, so they've seen serious fighting, but 72nd Division has been in Verdun since the beginning of the war. And their experience of war really stopped at the end of the Marne. So they have no experience at all of this sort of thing, and they have about 270 guns, and they're mostly old and slow firing. On paper, this is going to be a walkover. Well, it's like Russia going into Ukraine last year. Anyway, they don't start off on the 21st. They do start off on the 21st. It goes not as well as expected, but it's not bad. And on the 5th day of the battle, the leading elements, the leading German units reach Fort Douaumont. Now, I'm using this, which is a painting by André Brach, German painter, rather than the photo it's based on, which was taken by a man who became very famous in World War II, Hermann Göring, who was an artillery observer in Verdun in 1915. And as you can see, it's a mighty place. I'm using this because it's clearer. It's out from the glacis there across to the other side. That's 300 meters. That's about 250. A deep ditch all around. The ditch has got casemates in, which are armed. So the ditch is covered on all sides. There's underground communication into the main body of the fort, which is the barracks. And the barracks has been covered with what the French call special concrete. This is this immensely thick layer of shell-proof concrete that they developed in the 1980s and actually proved successful. And the fort it's a sort of disappearing fort. The lower floor is below ground, so there's only one floor above ground level there. It has guns in rotating turrets, of which this is the big one. You've all seen these in the Maginot Line. This is the 155mm gun here. It had 2 75s under another turret, and it had 2 retractable machine gun turrets. So it's not bad. All the auxiliary defences have gone, but the problem is there's no garrison there. There's basically, I won't say there's no one inside, but as you'll see, there aren't many people inside, and there is no official garrison. Now, on the morning of the 25th, the leading German units had this in their sights. This is Fort Douaumont here, and you can see it's a very low profile. You can also see there's no trees. Now, if you go to Verdun these days, you can't, and you go where they were to take that picture, you can't see it. Verdun, of course, was planted after the war, so it's all covered in trees, but there were no trees there at this time. There were stands of forest at Verdun, but nothing was allowed to cut the sight lines. There were 3 regiments directly in line, about 2.5 miles away. And, there's one in line, the 24th Brandenburgers, and then there were 2 others on their right. And they were all expecting to attack the fort that day. And then when the orders came up, they were not to attack the fort that day, but to stop 1,800 meters from the fort and then let the artillery soften it up for the next day, and then they'd go forward. Now, the Brandenburgers were directly in line with it, and they were very disgusted when the orders came up to see that the next day they were not to take the fort. It was going to be taken by the regiment on their right, that was the 12th Grenadiers. Well, they didn't like that at all, and as luck would have it, when the orders came up, the Brandenburgers got theirs, and the 12th Grenadiers didn't get theirs. They came up late, so Brandenburgers went off without waiting for the others, of course, as you do, and crashed down on the first French front line, rounded up lots of prisoners who said they weren't quite sure if there was anyone in the fort, and some of the French ran off, and the Germans went running off after them. It had been icy for days, the ground was really hard, and ran into machine gun fire that was hitting them from the flank, coming from the village near the fort, and scattered into one of the ravines nearby, and then began to work their way up close to the fort and went too far and got into their own artillery fire. And this was no laughing matter, because this is 2 heavy howitzer batteries. They're 280 millimeter howitzers that are firing on the fort. So they were using flares to tell the artillery observers that, you know, we're here, and nothing happened. The shells carried on falling. And so what do? Well, you can't stop. You can't go back. You can't dig in. So the only thing to do is to go forward. And 2 of the lieutenants, 2 of the officers rather, said, fine, that's it, we'll go for it. And they started heading up the glacis. And as luck would have it, 2 of them actually had cameras with them. And so we have photos of it happening. And one of them is this man. This is a pioneer, about 26, Lieutenant Vogt. This is one of his pictures. And you can see the group of men there picking their way through the wire there and going up the glacis. And if there's a little smudge up there, if you look carefully, and that's actually an observation turret. So if anybody's watching, they can see this happening. Now, you can see that man has a walking stick. So we know who he is. That's Captain Haupt, who was a regular. He commanded 7th Company of the 24th Brandenburgers, and he always had his walking stick with him. So we'll meet him again. When they got to the top here and looked down into the ditch, this is what they saw. Now, this is a 24-foot drop, and there's a 2-meter railing on the top of that. But as luck would have it, there were certain places where the edge of the ditch was broken and debris had fallen down to the bottom, so it wasn't quite so far down. And this man, Lieutenant Eugen Radke, who was in 6th Company, he and one of the sergeants knotted their rifle slings together, and the sergeant held on to the railing and he leant down as far as he could, and Radke slithered down onto one of these heaps of debris and then said, well, you're not going to leave me here, are you? But there were already a couple of Germans in the ditch. Actually, there is loads of information about who was where, because any man who was in the fort that day was asked to write an after-action report. And this was all, it's among the stuff that came back from Russia in 1991. So there's absolutely tons of it. So they got into the ditch, and more and more men were coming down. And this is, Radke came down into the ditch near one of the ditch bunkers. You can see these are big things. And if you look there, there's just you probably can't make him out. There's a man standing there. That is Lieutenant Klingenberg, and he's the other man with the camera. But Radke could see, you see, this is armed. There's a gun there in the casemate, and he didn't know whether he was going to be shot at when he got down. Nothing happened. Other men came round to join him. And by that time, more and more men were coming in. And you can see here another of the photos. You see the Germans lining up to go around the corner. There's a man in the breach. And you can see two men going up there. And this man, this is, say we have all the names. This is Musketeer Kuhn, and this is Musketeer Klein. And Kuhn has an artillery flag. And this is a huge, great red and white thing. And he's been sent up to the top of the fort to wave the flag, to try and get the artillery observers to see him and tell the gunners not to fire. But of course it's 4:15 in the afternoon in February, and it's snowing a bit, and the sky's low, and it's grey, and it just carries on. They carry on firing. And more men come in, and so they set up these poles. The ditch at Fort Douaumont had been used as a dump for about a year and a half, so there was all sorts of stuff in the ditch. And so they set up these poles here, and more men come down. And now what? Well, they're still being shelled. So the only thing to do is get inside the barracks. And it's too noisy out there to actually give an order. So this is all done by signs, like saying like this, you know, and then you lot go around that way. And they split like this in groups. And one group goes up over the top of the fort and into the courtyard and into the barracks at the back. And there's no one there. And it's all full of stuff. I say it's been used as a dump. There's loads of debris there, loads of stuff in the corridor. What do you do? Well, they walked along very gingerly and got to a door, and they could hear voices behind it. And then what? Well, this is Captain Haupt, the man with the walking stick. And he did well. Of course you would, wouldn't you? He took cigarettes out, and they all had a cigarette. And they stood there outside the door listening to French voices on the other side. And then Klingenberg hammered on the door and said, "The Germans are in the fort." And it went quiet. But nobody opened the door. And then another group of Germans appeared down the corridor from the other end, and they had found a Frenchman. So they said, "You tell him to surrender." So he did. And the door opened, the chap peeped out and then didn't like the look of what he saw and tried to shut it again. Well, too late by then. So they rounded up the first men. Where's everybody else? Everybody else was downstairs, and they were hiding from the shelling. The fort's been shelled for 5 days, with the very heaviest German artillery, the 42-centimetre Bertha howitzers, and the 380mm long max naval gun was firing on it. So this is terrifying to be in the fort, so they were all hiding. And in fact, there were about 72 of them. There was no officer. There was the man in, well, I won't say man in charge, but the man who'd been there longest was a battery sergeant named Chanot, and he'd been on his own in the fort from September to December 1915. About an hour after the Germans had got the fort, this man arrived, and this is Oberleutnant von Brandis, and he commanded 8th Company. He was delayed because they were on the right when the Brandenburgers attacked. So he had his flank in the air because the Grenadiers hadn't got their orders. And going forward towards the fort, they ran into machine gun fire from the village, and they had to deal with that until the Grenadiers came up. So by the time he got into the fort was already in German hands. Now, Haupt had taken, as senior officer present, he took command in the fort. And he gave Brandis orders to take command to outside and to organize for defense outside the fort, because they knew the French were going to attack. In fact, the French did counterattack that day. He also sent Brandis back to the battalion command post to give the message that the fort was safe in German hands. And he did that. And as the message was passed back, it became the fort is safe in von Brandis's hands. And that caused trouble some days later when the decorations came up, and indeed it went on causing trouble after the war for years. So the 25th of February, 5 days into the Battle of Verdun, and the Germans have got the keystone of the arch. and nobody's fought for it. So you can imagine for Germans, it's absolutely wonderful. And newspapers were printed. This is an example of 2 of them. This is the Mecklenburgische Zeitung here. Fort Douaumont from Verdun stormed. An armoured fort, the armoured Fort Douaumont stormed, safe in German hands. And this one from Vilnius, now the capital of Lithuania, saying the same thing. This is absolutely wonderful. Church bells ring, schools have a half holiday. It's marvellous. But what it also does is instill a certain feeling of complacency. Because there's Fort Douaumont, and there's the strategic heights, and that's where they're going to stop. So that enabled General Falkenhayn to say, look, to his commanders, you didn't understand what I was doing. You didn't think it would work. You warned me not to do it like this, and look, it's fine, it's working, we're nearly there, so keep going. But the commanders are saying, we can't keep going. We haven't got enough men. We need more men to come in now. We need relief. Now, Falkenhayn's plan was predicated on speed. There's this, the bombardment is going to crush everything. Nothing is going to resist the bombardment. Then the Army Corps are going to go in. They'll simply steamroller anything that might be left, but there won't actually be anything left. And then they'll get down here, and as I say, it's all going to be over by the Kaiser's birthday. So that's fine. You can carry on. You can go, and you don't need any more men. But look where everybody else is. That's Fort Douaumont. And that's where the rest of the German line is. And the rest of the German line is not so far forward. And Falkenhayn at this point is saying, we got Fort Douaumont so easily, you don't need more men to bring the flanks forward. But we have to bring the flanks forward to get to the strategic heights. You can do it with the men you've got. But the men are exhausted. They've been fighting since the 21st, and at this point, there's changes on the French side. And this man comes in, General Pétain on the 25th. He comes in at the head of Second Army. Second Army has been boosted by 4 new Army Corps, so it's even bigger than usual. He took command at 1 minute past midnight on the 26th, and he said that your first orders are you die where you stand, and nobody takes even 1 step back. And his second order is all guns to fire on the right bank. Now, you can see from the salient, I'm going back at 1 again, you can see from the flanks there, the German flanks, all guns have been firing on the right bank, and that's why those flanks haven't come forward. If the Germans are going to hold the fort, they've got to bring the flanks forward. If they don't hold the fort, they're going to get pushed back. And this is a galvanizing moment for the French, because if there was ever any suggestion at Verdun that the French would collapse, and it was very wobbly for the first 3 days, but if there was ever going to be any suggestion that they'd collapse, it's finished when the Germans get the fort. At that point, the French are going to fight at Verdun. They're not going to give up. So Falkenhayn's idea has already failed once the Germans have got the fort. Now, Pétain, as I say, he says all guns to fire on the right bank, and you might think, well, with useless supply lines, how are you going to do it? At the end of September 1914, the Germans had managed to cut, either to destroy completely or to limit very seriously the 2 main supply lines into Verdun. And that left Verdun simply with this little light railway that ran up from Bar-le-Duc, which is about 70 kilometres south, into Verdun. Well, what they also had was a plan. If you look at the yellow here, that's the light railway there, and it's got a little branch line, and this is the main road from Bar-le-Duc up to Verdun. Now, in 1915, the French drew up a plan to supply a battle in the salient, if it happened, to supply it by road. The French had had an automobile or a motor vehicle department since 1913. It was General Joffre who set it up. And they started moving troops by motor vehicle into battle in the Marne. You'll remember the taxis of the Marne, famous incident. I think they carried 2,700 men. So the rest of the 150,000 that were involved in the battle, they went by other means. The French carried on doing that through 1915. By the end of 1915, they were extremely experienced in the matter of trucking supplies and men into battle. And 2 days before, there was a regulatory commission for the road here. 2 days before, there was a regulatory commission for the road there. 2 days before the Germans attacked, the regulatory commission met, took over the road, cleared off all civilian traffic, organised a police service to cope with it, and 24 hours before the Germans attacked, the trucks started to roll. Now, they had a reserve at Verdun of 4,000 trucks, plus 2 other reserves that were available, so it gave them about 10,000 altogether that they could draw on. And within 24 hours of the start of the battle, they had transferred an entire infantry division to the front by truck. Now, when the Germans attacked, they attacked with 3 army corps against 2 understrength infantry divisions. And at the end of the first week, there were the same number of French soldiers on the right bank of the Meuse as there were German soldiers. So you can see the French managed, they had in their pockets, as it were, a plan to supply the Battle of Verdun that obviously Falkenhayn didn't know about. And that meant that they were not simply dependent on this little light railway. Now, Falkenhayn probably would have thought it's never going to work. You can't supply a battle of this magnitude by road. In any case, we will have got to the strategic heights before they've got themselves organised. But the thing is, the Germans falter on the 25th. They're exhausted. They need relief. The weather turns from icy cold to it thaws, and so the ground that's been hard becomes soft, and you can't get men and supplies in so easily, you can't get it out so easily, and so the battle starts to bog down. Now, when I was talking about complacency here, the capture of Fort Douaumont was so easy that it did look as if the Germans were just going to be able to get down to the strategic heights without too much trouble, despite the fact that they had had more difficulty than they thought before then. Now, on the 26th of February, the German general commanding 9th Reserve Division looked at this little yellow obstacle down here and said, well, that's very small. That's another fort. There's probably nobody in it. That's all right. Take Fort Vaux this very day. Well, if you read Alistair Horn, you will know that Fort Vaux was actually captured on the 7th of June. And this is the 26th of February that order goes out. In fact, they move off towards Fort Vaux on the 27th of June. But it takes until the 2nd of June to get to a place from which they can launch the siege of the fort, and the fort surrendered on the 7th of June. And all that time, they're not getting out from Fort Douaumont. Fort Douaumont has got the French 150 metres outside the walls. All the way through March, April, and into May, the Germans are trying to push out from Fort Douaumont. They know the French will try to take it back. They're trying to push the lines away. The fighting in that period, in all this area here, is incredibly bloody for both sides, and neither side is getting anywhere. The French are actually being pushed back very slowly. But the Germans, it takes the Germans for almost 4 months to get to there, to get Fort Vaux. Now, when Falkenhayn put his plan forward, his commanders said, that's no good. If we don't attack on both sides of the river, they will turn their guns on the left bank and they will hit us in the flank. And Falkenhayn felt he could disregard that because the French had hardly any guns at Verdun. They had 270, mostly old and slow firing, and the others were 75s. But look at the effect of it. You see, the observers there on those 3 hills, there's the famous 3 hills on the left bank, Hill 304, the Mortom, Goose Ridge, they are guiding the gunners to fire up the ravines. And they can see things that the observers on the right bank can't see. So it's blocking the Germans from coming forward. So Falkenhayn says, well, I didn't want to do this, but what we'll have to do is extend the battle just to take those hills there. And it won't be a big job. Well, it took until the end of May to get the Germans more or less into the position here. So once it's all right till you've got Fort Douaumont. And then they get stuck. Now, what's it like inside the fort? Well, it's hot, it's dark, it's always packed with people, never less than 1,000 people at any one time. If things are happening there, 2,000 to 3,000 people, could be more. The Germans never knew how many men were inside it. It had very primitive hygiene. I think probably even primitive is too strong a word. Those forts were not built for a siege, so the latrines were outside. Well, that's no use in a siege. So, of course, once the cesspits have filled up, the Germans have to set aside barrack rooms. If you die in the fort, then you go in a barrack room and quicklime is put on top. The air was very bad. Everything is sandbagged against gas. You might have to wear your gas mask all the time. There are parts of the fort where the air quality is so bad, there is oxygen for you to breathe, but there is rest, food, water if you bring some, because there isn't any in the fort. Medical services. It's command posts. So it's, for them, right behind the front line, it's fantastically important to hold on to them. For the Germans, as a resource, it's wonderful. You've got to get in and out, mind you, and the French shell the exits and the entrances all the time, and you take your life in your hands. And if you're wounded in the ditch, nobody's going to go out for you because it's too dangerous. So it's not a good place to be, and some men absolutely hate forts and any concrete, and particularly the sort of semi-buried, the infantry shelters and that, really hated going inside them. Some men preferred to be outside, but nevertheless it is right in the front line and it is enormously important. By the middle of May, it becomes clear that all they can hope to do is get to the high ground and hold on for the winter. And by then, there's no question of the Germans saying, well, the French are going to surrender, you know. We're going to win this. That conversation stops completely. And once you get into June and you've got the Brusilov offensive coming up. Well, the Brusilov offensive starts on the 4th. And the last German attempt to get anywhere comes on the 23rd of June. There's Fort Douaumont. And the plan is to take that line of high ground here, and to make sure they get across that, they use phosgene. Now, they tried phosgene on the left bank a couple of times, but they hadn't tried it in large quantities, but actually they didn't have a very large quantity, so they could only fire it right in the middle of the line here, but that's the part that's important. And as you can see, they just managed to get there on the blue line, but that's it, they don't get anywhere else. They try again on the 11th of July, they get a little bit more there, and that's it. And that's where it stops. And the French go on fighting. And I've had people say to me over the years, oh, the French did nothing to help us on the Somme. And I say, yes, they did. They went on fighting at Verdun all summer when they could have slacked off, and they didn't. And they wanted their fort back. And on the 24th of October, they launched the first of their counterattacks, and they recaptured Fort Douaumont. And this is what it looked like seen from the air. Now, the problem I've got lots of pictures of the fort when it was recaptured, and they only show bits of the fort, so it's difficult to show you something that looks like anything, which is why I've chosen this one. So if you look at this one, that's the southeastern corner, and that gives you a bit of an idea of the state the fort was in. It had obviously been shelled for all the time since the 21st of February. It had several holes in the roof at one end. The odd thing about Fort Douaumont was at one end the concrete was not as thick as at the other end, and some of the big shells had come through where the concrete wasn't so thick. It had actually been evacuated the day before by the Germans for about 12 hours, and as a fire had started in the Pioneer Depot the day before, and they were very afraid of an explosion like the one in May. There was a gigantic explosion in Fort Douaumont on the 8th of May, and the official death toll was 679, but the senior medical officer, who in civilian life was actually a gynecologist with a fashionable practice in Berlin, which must have been rather different. He reckoned it was nearer 1,000, but men were simply blown apart, so you couldn't tell. So I say, I think the 679 is identifiable men. And when this fire started in the Pioneer Depot, they were very afraid that this was going to be another big explosion, and the commandant had ordered everyone out. Well, not everyone got the message, so some men stayed on for a while, and then the acting commandant said, no, we're going to go. And so it was empty for a while, and then, in fact, another German officer who'd gone out with the first lot thought, maybe we shouldn't, and came back with a few men, picked up some stragglers, and I say they were 28, 4 officers and 24 men in the fort when it was recaptured. The French were trying to get Fort Vaux that day, and they didn't get it. And so it was a week before the Germans evacuated Fort Vaux, and on the 3rd of November, that meant that the main line of resistance the breach was repaired, and the main line of resistance was intact again. Now, I mentioned earlier in this talk von Brandis sending the message back to say that that the fort was safe in German hands, and the message coming as the fort was safe in von Brandis's hands. And several days after this event, the capture of the fort, decorations came up. And among them, Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest award for valour, came up in 2 examples. And Captain Haupt got one, as you might imagine, and you might think Radke would get the other, and he didn't. It went to von Brandis. And this caused some trouble. And there was trouble also because when all the other decorations that came up, for Haupt's company, which was the 7th, and von Brandis's company, which was the 8th, were decorated from top to toe. I have read that it didn't matter whether you were in the fort or not, you got a decoration anyway. Radke's company got nothing, possibly because the officers were all out of action, and so no recommendations went in. The pioneers got nothing, and this caused so much trouble that men almost came to blows over it in the fort. And it was only the commandant saying, look, the enemy's outside, you can deal with that afterwards, but the enemy's outside at the moment, so don't fight now. But this trouble went on throughout, it rumbled away throughout the war. And at the end of the war, Haupt sort of went back into civilian life and kept his head down. But Brandis he used to go and do talks about how I stormed the fort. And the men who had been passed over formed a syndicate. And they went to the talks too. And they jeered and stamped and heckled. And they shouted, you weren't there, you're a fraud. And these, of course, were often very fashionable meetings. And so this caused trouble. And poor old Radke, who had been seriously wounded the next day, and I think was never really well, he was not part of the syndicate, but he was dropped from the regimental association. And it was only in 1932 when Radke wrote his own book, and it has a very telling title. It's called Douaumont, as it really was. And he then got some recognition. He had actually belatedly got the Iron Cross First Class, but at this point he got promotion at work, and he got a signed photo of the Crown Prince. And also this man. Now, if you've read Alistair Horn, you'll know who this is. This is Corporal Kunze. And Kunze's story is quite odd because according to his story, he and his group of friends got blown down into the ditch by the blast of an exploding shell, and they formed a human pyramid, which was something that they practiced. And he and another man climbed into one of the ditch bunkers and went down the passageways underground into the main body of the fort and came out by the big gun turret. And he went running in and said, Germans are in the fort, you've got to surrender, and rounded up the men and then took them, shepherding them somewhere in the fort to lock them up. He lost them. But he found food and he found wine. And so he fell too, because after all, the poor chaps had been on iron rations since the 21st. And when he woke up, he found the Germans in the fort. Now, he reported to Captain Haupt, and he according to Kunze, and as I say, there is loads of information about this because he also wrote an after-action report. He reported to Captain Haupt, and Haupt said he passed the message on. and didn't. And Kunze, being just a sort of lowly chap, couldn't nudge him and say, you know, you didn't tell anyone, did you? So his story was also hidden until the mid-30s, when the battalion commander wrote a book, which is a slightly odd book, actually. But anyway, never mind. He brought Kunze's story to the fore, and Kunze then also got recognition. But this argument about who was first in the fort, Radke is known to be the first officer into the ditch. And people have said to me sometimes, what do you think Kunze was the first man in the fort? Well, nobody will ever know. And what do you call in the fort? Do you mean into the barracks? Do you mean into the ditch? Nobody will ever know. It is still argued about, just the way that Falkenhayn's plan is also argued about. Now, just to wrap up, the Battle of Verdun, as I say, lasted for 300 days. It finally came to an end on the 18th of December 1916, when the French counterattacked again on the 16th of December in driving snow, took the Germans completely by surprise. There was a total German collapse on the right bank. The French took 11,000 prisoners in those 2 days, and loads of guns. And after that, the Germans were never a threat at Verdun. Verdun became a secondary front for them. So if you're trying to justify a battle that hasn't achieved anything for 300 days to your population, you've got to pick out some event that is a wonderful thing that they can concentrate on and feel proud of. And Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who took over command at Verdun at the end of August 1916, when Falkenhayn, I won't say was dismissed, because they don't say that, do they? They say he was invited to give his resignation. And Hindenburg came in and took over, and he called Verdun a beacon of German heroism. Now, since they knew that there might not be anybody in the fort, I'm not sure I call it a beacon of German heroism, but it was certainly a beacon of German boldness. And so for that reason, I think it's really rather sad to see this heroic event used to sell furniture polish and, oh, now I lost it again, to sell furniture polish and boot and shoe polish. But here you are, ladies and gentlemen, as seen by Quack and Erdale, the heroic Germans, no doubt carrying the polish in their packs, as they stormed the fort from completely the wrong side, led by Musketeer Kuhn with the artillery flag. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.